The wall clock read exactly 5:45 p.m. as Gus Mitchell stared at his reflection in the mirror of his master suite, atop the most luxurious building on Manhattan's Upper East Side. His fingers trailed delicately over the fabric of his custom-tailored Italian suit, while a deep sigh escaped his lips. In just a few minutes, that $15,000 suit would be swapped for a basic t-shirt and a pair of worn-out jeans. "Are you really willing to do this?" he asked himself, as his brown eyes fixed on his own image. At 35, Gus had built a tech empire from scratch. His software development company, GM Tech, was valued in the billions, and his face frequently graced the covers of the country's top business magazines. Yet, on that autumn afternoon, the successful entrepreneur was preparing for a peculiar mission to discover the true essence of his fiancée Helena Sanders' family without anyone knowing his real identity. The plan was simple in theory but complex in execution: to pose as a rideshare driver in the neighborhood where her family lived. As he changed his clothes, memories of his humble childhood in a small Midwestern town flooded his mind. He recalled his father selling popsicles on the streets and his mother sewing late into the night. It was precisely that modest beginning that had made him question the authenticity of the people around him, ever since success knocked on his door. Helena was different from all the other women he had met. In 6 months of dating, she had never shown interest in his fortune or social status. On the contrary, she always preferred simple outings and low-key dates, yet an inner voice wouldn't let him rest, especially after previous experiences with people who had only gotten close for their own gain. Now dressed in his plain clothes, Gus grabbed the worn-out cap he'd bought at a department store and the cell phone he would use exclusively for the rideshare app. He glanced at the engagement ring stored safely away, a delicate piece chosen by Helena, far simpler than what the other women he'd dated might have desired. 3 months, he murmured to himself. 3 months to truly get to know the Sanders family. The plan was meticulously orchestrated. He had already set up a temporary home office, explaining to Helena that he was focusing on a special project that would require fewer trips and external meetings. The fiancée, dedicated to her career as a literature teacher, understood perfectly the need for privacy at work. Before leaving, Gus checked his appearance in the mirror once more. The cap partially shadowed his face and his stubble helped alter his features. His hands, once always immaculately groomed, now looked rougher thanks to weeks of purposely applying a natural tanning lotion. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Helena. "Good luck on the project, love. I know it's going to be intense, but don't forget to take care of yourself, okay? Love you." Gus felt a tightness in his chest. He hated the idea of not being completely honest with her, but he needed to be sure. He couldn't bear the thought of discovering after the wedding that his fortune was the real reason her family was interested. He headed down to the building's garage, where his personal driver waited discreetly with a 2019 silver Honda Civic, purchased specifically for this mission. George, his loyal employee for years and the only person who knew the plan, handed him the keys with a worried look. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay on standby, Dr. Mitchell?" George asked. "No need, George. I have to do this alone," Gus replied as he got into the car. The simple fabric seat was a far cry from the Italian leather of his Mercedes. He started the car and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the engagement ring in his jeans pocket. For the next 3 months, he would be just Gus, the friendly, rideshare driver always available for trips around Brooklyn, where the Sanders family lived. His first mission? To familiarize himself with the area and begin building his new persona. As he drove through the bustling streets of New York City, Gus reflected on how his life had transformed into something worthy of a daytime drama. He, one of the country's most successful businessmen, was about to pose as a rideshare driver to test the character of his fiancée's family. It was ironic how fate sometimes played tricks. He, who always prized transparency in his business, was now embarking on the biggest charade of his life. Brooklyn revealed its unique rhythm that Monday morning. Gus as he now presented himself, parked his Civic in front of a traditional neighborhood bakery. It was his 4th day as a rideshare driver in the area, and he was already beginning to learn the local rhythms and meet its characters. Mrs. Carey, The warm-hearted owner of the bakery, known for serving early breakfasts, had already noticed his constant presence and called him over to sample her toasted bread with cream cheese. "On the house for those who start early," she said with a welcoming smile. Sitting at one of the small sidewalk tables, Gus watched the activity, his attention especially caught by the two-story yellow house across the street where Helena's parents lived. Richard Sanders, his future father-in-law, left every day at the same time to tend to the community garden before heading to his job as a bank manager. That morning, Gus saw him carrying a few lettuce and tomato seedlings, greeting everyone he passed with a genuine smile. "Your Richard is an angel," remarked Mrs. Carey as she approached with another cup of coffee. "He started that garden 5 years ago after losing a promotion at the bank. Instead of becoming bitter, he transformed an abandoned lot into something that benefits the entire neighborhood." Gus absorbed every detail like a sponge. It was exactly these everyday moments he wanted to know, the stories that wouldn't surface at a formal family dinner or a Sunday lunch. His phone buzzed. It was a ride request. The passenger's name made his heart race. Marcia Sanders, Helena's mother. Taking a deep breath and adjusting his cap, he drove to the indicated address. He stopped in front of the yellow house, watching in his rearview mirror as his future mother-in-law approached. "Good morning," Marcia said as she got into the car. "You're new around here, aren't you? I've been getting a lot of Uber rides lately and haven't seen you before." "Yes, ma'am. I just started this week. I moved to the area to make the rides easier," Gus replied, modulating his voice to sound more casual, a trick he'd practiced for days. During the ride to the municipal market, where Marcia taught cooking classes for a local community project, she talked about the neighborhood, about how things had changed over the years, yet the essence remained the same. "You know, kid, nowadays everyone wants an apartment in a gated community, but here we still leave our windows open and know our neighbors by name." Gus listened intently, asking just enough questions to hide his true interest. He learned that Marcia, in addition to her cooking classes, made sweets on commission to help cover household expenses. "My daughter doesn't even know, but sometimes I miss her events to deliver orders. I don't want her worrying. She already has so much on her plate with the engagement and her job." That information hit Gus like a punch to the gut. Helena had never mentioned that her mother did extra work, and apparently she wasn't aware of it either. The simplicity and pride of that family were beginning to shine through in their small actions. Returning to his observation post at Mrs. Carey's bakery, Gus noticed unusual activity at the Sanders house. Helena had arrived for a surprise lunch. He knew her schedule, but had to feign surprise when she appeared, radiant in a floral dress and carrying shopping bags. "Look, Richard," called a neighbor from across the street. "Your little girl is visiting. Don't forget, today is our afternoon coffee time at our place." Gus watched as Helena helped her father carry the seedlings into the house, laughing at something he had said. His heart clenched as he saw her so natural, so genuine in her family environment. For a moment he wondered if he was making a mistake with all this investigation. The day passed with several more rides around the neighborhood. Between trips, Gus collected fragments of local life. He discovered that Richard Sanders refused bribes at the bank, even when some customers insisted on thanking him for credit approvals. He learned that Marcia always set aside a portion of her sweets to donate to the community daycare, even when the orders didn't cover all the costs. Late in the afternoon, he received a message from Helena. "I spent the day with my parents. I wish you were here. They would have loved you just as you are, you know." Guilt gnawed at him, yet something told him he had to continue. It wasn't just about finding out whether they were opportunists. It was about truly knowing the people who were about to become his family. 2 weeks had passed since Gus began his double life as a rideshare driver. The sun hadn't even risen when he parked his Civic in front of Mrs. Carey's bakery. The routine was becoming natural. The aroma of fresh coffee, the early morning chats with the first customers, the hustle of local shopkeepers opening up. "I brought you a piece of cornbread today, Gus," Mrs. Carey said, placing a generous slice in front of him. "You look so thin. A driver needs to eat well." As he savored the cornbread, Gus watched Richard Sanders crossing the street toward the community garden. In recent days, he'd noticed that his future father-in-law always carried an extra thermos along with his own. The mystery was solved when an elderly man in a janitor's uniform stopped to chat with Richard. "Fresh coffee, Mr. Joe," Richard said, offering the extra thermos to the janitor. "And how's your granddaughter? Has she recovered from that cold?" "Thank God, yes. That syrup Mrs. Marcia made worked wonders," the man replied, sipping his coffee with satisfaction. Gus felt warmth in his chest witnessing the scene. It was these small gestures that revealed a person's true character. Then his phone buzzed. It was Helena calling. For a moment, his two worlds collided, and he had to compose himself before answering. "Good morning, love. Are you at work already?" her cheery voice asked from the other end. "Yes, starting early today," he replied, striving to maintain the professional tone he used when he was supposedly in the office. "How's the project at school?" "Incredible. I got permission to start a reading club for underprivileged kids. I'm going to use my lunch break for it. Isn't that wonderful?" Gus smiled proudly. Helena had never mentioned this project before. Could it be that she had other dreams and plans quietly unfolding? The morning passed with a few routine rides until a special request arrived. It was Marcia Sanders again, this time with a destination at a hospital in the southern part of the city. Gus's heart raced. Had something serious happened? During the ride, Marcia seemed anxious, clutching a folder filled with documents. "You know, Gus, if it's okay to call you Gus, sometimes life throws us curveballs. Richard is having some health issues, but he's too stubborn to tell our daughter." Gus felt a lump in his throat. "Something serious, Mrs. Sanders. The doctor ordered some expensive tests. We're trying to gather the money without worrying Helena. She already has so much on her mind with the engagement and her job, and her fiancé, you know, he's such a busy man. We don't want to cause any problems." At that moment, Gus wanted to reveal everything, to say he could help, that he had more than enough means. But he knew he couldn't, not yet. "Don't you think your daughter would like to know that she might be able to help?" he ventured, maintaining his rideshare persona. Marcia sighed. "Helena has always been like that, you know, since she was little, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. When her father lost that promotion at the bank, she even wanted to drop out of college to work. Of course, we didn't let her. Now she's finally found someone and is happy. I don't want anything to jeopardize that." At the hospital, Gus waited for Marcia, just as any considerate driver would. He noticed when she emerged, her eyes a little red, but her smile determined. On the ride back, she grew more silent, commenting only on the weather and the flowers in the community garden that needed watering. In the afternoon, during a break between rides, Gus passed by the school where Helena taught. Hidden in his car, he saw her step out at lunchtime, not to rest, but carrying a box of books for the reading club. Several students helped her, all smiling and clearly enchanted by their teacher. Back at his usual spot at Mrs. Carey's bakery, Gus noticed unusual activity at the Sanders house. Through an open kitchen window, he saw Marcia arranging boxes of sweets. A neighbor approached. "Marcia, you can't keep taking on so many orders like this. You'll end up burning yourself out." "Oh, nonsense, Maria. Work never killed anyone." "And now with Richard's tests," Marcia replied. Gus closed his eyes, lost in thought. Helena's family was clearly facing financial difficulties because of Richard's health, but they kept it secret so as not to worry her. At the same time, Helena herself devoted her free time to helping underprivileged children without any fuss or recognition. His phone buzzed again, a message from Helena. "Love, how about a dinner just for us this weekend? I miss you." Gus looked toward the yellow house, at Marcia tirelessly working in her kitchen, and at Richard returning from the garden with vegetables to donate, and felt the weight of his secret more than ever. At 7 p.m., Gus finally returned to his apartment, on the Upper East Side. After a long, relaxing shower, he changed from his simple attire into his elegant suit. Helena was on her way for the romantic dinner they had planned. His heart was heavy with all the day's discoveries, especially about Richard's health. The doorbell rang, and when he opened it, there she stood. beautiful in a simple blue dress, carrying a folder filled with her students' assignments to grade. "I couldn't resist bringing a little work with me," she smiled shyly. "I promise I'll finish grading quickly before dinner." While Helena concentrated on her papers at the dining table, Gus watched her discreetly. How had he never noticed the subtle signs of fatigue on her face, the barely concealed dark circles behind her light makeup, the way she occasionally massaged her tense shoulders. "Love, are you all right? You look worried," Helena asked, looking up from her work. "Just tired from work," he lied, feeling his heart sink with every secret he kept. "How are your parents? It's been a while since I've seen them." Helena smiled, though Gus noticed a flicker of concern in her eyes. "They're fine. Well, Dad is a bit worn out, but he says it's just age. Mom is busy with her cooking classes. You should see how her project has grown." Gus knew exactly how that project had grown. He had accompanied Marcia there several times in recent weeks. He remembered the sparkle in her eyes when she taught simple recipes to people eager to improve their lives, even when she was exhausted from her secret extra work. The dinner passed quietly, with Helena talking about her students and the reading club. "You know, Gus, sometimes I wonder if we shouldn't have a simpler wedding. Use the money for something more meaningful." "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Well, one of my students, Jade, has a mother who needs medical treatment and doesn't have health insurance. I've been thinking about how we could help more people with what we have." At that moment, Gus almost blurted out everything. Helena wasn't concerned with a lavish wedding or his fortune. She was thinking about how to help others, even when her own family faced difficulties unknown to her. Helena's phone buzzed. It was a message from her mother. "How strange. Our mom is asking if you can come by on Sunday. She never sends messages this late." Gus froze. He had taken Marcia to the hospital that afternoon. Could it be something related to Richard's tests? "It'll be nice to see your parents," he commented, trying to sound casual. "It's been too long since we've all had lunch together." Helena agreed, though she seemed pensive. "You know what's funny? There's a rideshare driver that my mom always praises. She says he's so attentive, always around when she needs him. I think she even baked a cake for him." Gus choked on his wine, prompting Helena to laugh. "Calm down, love. No need to be jealous of the driver. Mom's always like that, treating everyone like family." After dinner, as he accompanied Helena to the elevator, Gus felt the weight of his investigation more than ever. Here was a woman who cared more about her underprivileged students than about a lavish wedding, who had no idea of the hardships her parents endured to protect her, who saw goodness in everyone, even in a rideshare driver who in truth was her own fiancé in disguise. Back in his empty apartment, Gus picked up the worn-out cap he'd used for his disguise. Tomorrow would bring another day of discoveries, of shouldering an ever heavier secret, of observing the family he so desperately wanted to protect Helena from. In the mirror, his reflection revealed two different people: the successful businessman and the humble driver who was learning the true meaning of family. His phone buzzed with a new ride request for the next day. It was Marcia again, with the destination being the hospital. Gus sat on the edge of his king-size bed, holding his phone as if it could provide all the answers he sought. How could he continue with this plan now that he knew the family was facing real problems? How could he maintain his investigation when every new discovery proved that these were extraordinary people in their simplicity? Sunday dawned with a light drizzle, typical of New York. Gus watched from his car as Helena entered her parents' home. He had purposely accepted a nearby ride, wanting to be close in case the news about Richard's health wasn't good. Marcia had cancelled the hospital ride the day before, saying only that she needed to take care of a few things at home first. The uncharacteristic behavior of the always organized lady made Gus even more apprehensive. "Hey, Gus!" Mrs. Carey's familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was crossing the street with a brightly colored umbrella. "Aren't you coming for your coffee today? I made that carrot cake you love." While savoring the cake at the bakery, Gus had a perfect view of the Sanders house. He saw Helena embracing her father in a long hug, and something in his heart tightened. Richard looked more subdued than usual, even as he tried to keep his trademark smile. "You know what I find funny?" Mrs. Carey commented as she sat down with him. The Sanders daughter from the Upper East Side never shows up at our bakery. They say it's because she only goes to fancy places. Gus nearly choked on his coffee. What do you mean? Oh, just neighborhood gossip. They say she's snobbish, that she's ashamed of her neighborhood. But I've never believed it. The way your Richard talks about her, she must be a good kid. That conversation revealed something Gus hadn't considered. Just as he was investigating Helena's family, the locals had their own impressions of him, or rather, of his rich and distant persona. His phone buzzed. It was a message from George. "Dr. Mitchell, are you sure you don't want me to pick up Helena today? You always drive her back after Sunday lunch." It was true. How would he explain his absence? He quickly typed, "Tell her I had an emergency video meeting." Inside the Sanders home, the Sunday lunch was in full swing. Through the living room window, Gus could see the family gathered. Helena helped her mother set the table while Richard tried to sit straight at the head of the table, clearly uncomfortable. "Is that young man feeling okay?" a child passing by on the sidewalk asked, pointing at Richard. "No, sweetheart," Marcia replied quickly. "Richard is just tired from work." But Gus knew it was more than that. In recent weeks, as a driver, he had overheard worried conversations between Marcia and the neighbors, comments about expensive tests and treatments. The situation seemed more serious than he'd initially thought. The lunch stretched on for several hours. At one point, Gus saw Helena step out into the backyard with her mother, the two speaking in hushed, serious tones. His heart raced when he noticed Helena wiping her eyes. Had Marcia finally revealed Richard's condition? His phone rang. It was Helena. He took a deep breath before answering. "Hi, love," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Sorry for calling in the middle of your meeting. No problem. What happened?" he asked. "Dad, he's not well. He had to get some tests done and—" She paused, struggling to hold back tears. "Why didn't they tell me sooner, Gus? I could have helped." At that moment, Gus felt the weight of his own secret even more acutely. He, too, was hiding something from her, wasn't he? "Love, are you okay? Should I cancel my meeting and come over?" he offered. "No, no need," she replied. "Actually, could we postpone the wedding plans a little? I need to help cover his treatment expenses and—" "Helena, you know I can—" "No, Gus," she interrupted firmly. "I don't want to use your money. They're my parents, my responsibility. I just need some time to sort things out." After the call ended, Gus sat in his car watching the Sanders house. He saw Helena leave, embracing her parents for what felt like an eternity. He saw Richard, though visibly tired, head to the community garden to water his plants. He saw Marcia in the kitchen, likely already planning more sweet orders to help with the bills. Then a new message arrived, from George again. "Dr. Mitchell, the event venue just called about the payment for next week's engagement party." The engagement party. With everything happening, Gus had completely forgotten about it. How could he proceed with plans for a lavish celebration when Helena's family was in trouble? How could he maintain his disguise as a rideshare driver when he increasingly needed to show up as Gus, the fiancé? The week began with a changed atmosphere in the neighborhood. News of Richard Sanders' health had spread, and Gus noticed how the community quietly rallied to help. Mrs. Carey now set aside a basket of bread and pastries every morning for the Sanders family. Neighbors took turns caring for the community, garden giving Richard a chance to rest. In his life as Gus the businessman, things were equally complicated. Helena had cancelled 3 consecutive dates, always with the same excuse. "I need to sort out some things, love." He knew exactly what she was doing. She'd taken him as Gus the driver to job interviews at private schools that offered better pay. "Another coffee, Gus?" Mrs. Carey offered on yet another morning. "You look so worried." "It's just that sometimes you get so involved, you know? Learning all these personal stories," he replied, glancing over at the Sanders house. "And let me tell you, yesterday Helena, Richard's daughter, even got a ride with me. Poor thing. She was so anxious. Looks like she's going to end up teaching at 2 schools. Gus's heart ached. Helena hadn't mentioned anything about a second job during their conversations as fiancé. His phone buzzed, a new ride request from Marcia. The destination, the event venue where the engagement party was to be held in a few days. During the ride, Marcia sounded especially nervous. "You know, Gus, sometimes life puts us in really tough spots. I need to cancel my daughter's party, but I'm just too scared to go in there by myself." "Ma'am, would you like me to come with you?" Gus offered, feeling increasingly torn between his two identities. At the elegant office of the event venue, Gus watched as Marcia explained the situation, trying to maintain her dignity while requesting the cancellation. The event coordinator, a serious-faced woman, consulted the contract. "Mrs. Sanders, unfortunately, the cancellation deadline has passed. You'll have to incur a considerable penalty." "But there must be something we can do," Marcia argued, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a family health issue." Gus observed the scene, feeling powerless in his role as a driver. He knew he could resolve everything with one phone call, but how could he explain his involvement? Back in the car, Marcia finally let her tears fall. "I don't know how I'll tell Helena. She's already working so hard, saving so much." That afternoon, Gus received another ride request. It was Helena leaving an interview for a job. She got into the car looking exhausted, not recognizing him beneath his cap and sunglasses. "Where to?" he asked, modulating his voice. "Lincoln Elementary School, please," she replied while checking her phone. "I need to drop off some documents before it closes." During the ride, Helena spoke on the phone with a friend. "No, Carol, I'm not giving up on the wedding. Just postponing it a bit. Gus will understand. He's such a wonderful man, you know. Sometimes I even feel bad that I can't give him the party he deserves." Gus wanted to shout that he didn't care about any party, that he only wanted to see her happy and that he could help with everything. But at that moment he was merely Gus, the silent driver witnessing yet another chapter of their unfolding story. At the end of the day, back in his luxurious Upper East Side apartment, Gus stared at the engagement party invitation laid out on his table. In a week, he was supposed to celebrate his love for Helena with a grand celebration, while her family faced financial hardships due to Richard's health. Then his phone rang. It was Helena again. "Love, I need to tell you something," she began hesitantly. "About the party." "I need to talk to you too," Gus responded, making a decision. He couldn't continue the charade any longer. It was time to reveal everything. His disguise, his discoveries, his true feelings for the family he'd come to love through the small windows of observation from his silver Civic. That night, Gus's apartment felt colder and more impersonal than ever. Seated on his Italian-designed sofa, he held the worn-out cap he'd used as his disguise, mentally rehearsing how to tell Helena the whole truth. Their phone conversation had ended with, "We need to meet in person tomorrow," leaving both in suspense. The next morning, defying his recent routine, Gus did not go to his usual observation spot at Mrs. Carey's bakery. Instead, he donned one of his most expensive suits and drove his Mercedes to Brooklyn. It was time for Gus, the businessman, to visit his fiancée's family. Parking in front of the yellow house, he noticed how everything looked different from this perspective. He was no longer hidden by the anonymity of his silver Civic, nor did he have his cap to obscure his face. It was simply him, bearing the full weight of his choices and secrets. Marcia answered the door, surprised by the unexpected visit. "Gus, what a pleasant surprise. Helena isn't here. In fact, Mrs. Sanders, I came to speak with you and Richard," Gus interrupted gently, his heart racing. In the modest living room, so different from his minimalist apartment, Richard sat in his favorite armchair, looking visibly more worn than in previous days. Yet his eyes still held that spark of wisdom that Gus had come to admire through his discreet observations. "Has something happened, son?" Richard asked, gesturing for Gus to sit down. "Yes, Richard. Something very important has been going on," Gus began, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture. "In fact, it's been happening for weeks." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Marcia went to answer and returned with a confused expression. "It's Mrs. Carey. She said she needs to speak urgently about Gus." Gus's blood ran cold. Mrs. Carey entered the room, carrying a basket of bread and her signature colorful umbrella. Upon seeing Gus, her eyes widened in recognition. But you are," she stammered. alternating her gaze between Gus and the Sanders. Gus, he completed, rising. Or rather, the rideshare driver who's been cruising around the AE neighborhood these past few weeks. The ensuing silence was deafening. Marcia covered her mouth, recalling all the intimate conversations she'd shared with the supposed driver. Richard straightened in his chair, his expression a mix of surprise and something Gus couldn't quite decipher. "I came to tell you everything," Gus continued, his voice trembling slightly, "about how I created this disguise to truly get to know you, about how I wanted to be sure you weren't opportunists like others who had approached me in the past. All those rides," Marcia murmured, sinking heavily onto the sofa. "The conversations about Helena, about Richard's problems." "Sweetheart," Richard interrupted in a calm yet firm tone, "do you have any idea what you've done?" "I do, Richard, and every day of this experience taught me more about the true meaning of family than all my years of business success," Gus replied, tears welling in his eyes. "I learned about integrity watching you care for the community garden even when you were ill. I learned about true love seeing how Mrs. Carey stayed up late, making sweets to help with expenses. I learned about generosity from the way you all put Helena's happiness above your own troubles." Mrs. Carey, who had been silently watching, stepped forward. "That's why you were always here every morning, watching, making sure everyone was okay." "Exactly, Mrs. Carey. Every cup of coffee, every conversation, every slice of cake taught me what a real community is," Gus said sadly. "But now Helena is hurting. She's working 2 jobs, trying to postpone our wedding, all to help you, and I can't stand by pretending not to know." At that moment, footsteps were heard on the porch. The door opened and Helena entered, carrying several grocery bags. Her eyes swept over the unusual scene, her parents with astonished expressions, Mrs. Carey with tears in her eyes, and Gus, her fiancé, holding her father with the same tenderness that she had seen Gus do so many times. Helena froze in the doorway, the grocery bag still in her hands. Her eyes flitted over each face, trying to absorb the heavy atmosphere. It was Gus who finally broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. "Helena, my love, we need to talk," he said, still gently supporting Richard until he was seated again. "What's going on here?" she asked, setting the bags down. "Why does everyone look so troubled? And why are you holding Dad just like that driver used to?" She stopped, mid-sentence, her eyes widening as realization dawned. Marcia quickly moved to her daughter, as if to shield her from the impact of the truth about to be revealed. "How do you know about Gus?" Helena questioned, her voice trembling. "How do you know how he used to hold Dad?" Gus took a deep breath and pulled the worn-out cap from his pocket, the very cap that had been his companion during weeks of disguise. "Because I am Gus, Helena. For the past few weeks, I've been living a double life as a rideshare driver, getting to know your family, your neighborhood, your true selves." A silence followed, broken only by the soft rustle of the wind against the curtains. Helena stared at the cap in his hand, as if that simple object held every answer in the universe. "All those rides," she murmured, recalling the stories her mother had told about the kind driver. "All the times Mom mentioned Gus, was it you?" "Yes," Gus replied, stepping closer. "I needed to be sure, Helena. I had to know if your family was different from the opportunists who had come close to me before. But what I discovered was far more than that. So while I was juggling 2 jobs, trying to help pay for Dad's treatment, you were investigating us?" Helena's voice trembled with disbelief and hurt. "Sweetheart," Richard interjected, his voice tired yet firm, "before you judge, listen to what he has to say. Sometimes people take crooked paths to reach the right destination." Mrs. Carey, her eyes glistening with tears, moved closer to Helena. "Dear, do you know how many mornings he spent at the bakery just watching, making sure everyone was okay? How many times he took your mother to the doctor, listened to her worries, helped your father in the garden?" Helena looked at Gus, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Beyond the successful businessman she had fallen in love with, she now saw the man who had shed his status to truly understand her family. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked softly. "Because each day I discovered more about how special your family is," Gus replied, his voice thick with emotion. I saw your father refusing bribes at the bank, your mother working late to make extra sweets, you teaching underprivileged children during your lunch break. Every discovery made me question not only my own prejudices, but who I truly was. Marcia, unable to hold back her tears any longer, let them fall freely. Honey, you have no idea how many times I spoke about my worries, about Dad's treatment, about you. And why reveal everything now? Helena asked, still processing. Every detail, because I can't stand to see you sacrificing yourself, working 2 jobs trying to postpone our wedding. While I have the means to help, Gus stepped even closer, taking her hands in his. I don't want to help as a rich businessman who solves everything with money, but as a son who has learned the true value of family. At that moment, footsteps were heard on the porch. The door opened, and Helena's parents stepped into the room. Helena stood frozen in the doorway, the grocery bag still in hand, as her parents took their places. Then Richard spoke softly. All those times that Gus showed up when we needed him, Helena said, her voice softening, it was you taking care of us. It was me learning what true love is, Gus replied, gently wiping away a tear from his cheek. I learned that real wealth isn't measured by a bank account, but by how willing you are to water a community garden, even when you're sick, to make sweets late into the night to help out, or to give extra lessons to children in need. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating that moment of raw truth. Outside, neighbors passed by, unaware that inside that yellow house, a love story was being rewritten. Not one based on suspicion and investigation, but on discoveries of what family truly means. That evening, under the starry Brooklyn sky, Helena finally sat beside Gus on a park bench in front of her parents' house. After the initial shock, she asked for time to process everything, and he had respected her space. Now, under the soft glow of streetlights, they prepared for a conversation that could change everything. You know what impresses me the most? Helena began, breaking the silence. It isn't that you disguised yourself as a driver, or that you investigated my family. It's how you allowed yourself to be transformed by this experience. Gus looked at his hands, recalling how they had adapted to steering the Civic, carrying grocery bags, and tending to the community garden. Your family taught me more about real value in just a few weeks than all my years running a billion-dollar company, he confessed. Every morning at Mrs. Carey's bakery was a lesson in humanity. Helena smiled softly, remembering the stories her mother once told about the kind driver Gus. Mom is going to miss her talks with Gus, you know? She always said he was the only one who truly listened. And I'm going to miss Mrs. Carey's cakes, Gus replied, making Helena laugh for the first time since everything was revealed. But now I can be myself, without disguises, learning and living with your family the right way. A group of children ran across the park, their laughter echoing in the night. They were students from the reading club Helena had started. Professor Gus, one of them shouted, waving, where's your car? Helena looked at her fiancé in surprise. You too? Yeah, he admitted, blushing slightly. On my free afternoons, I even helped out with your reading project. The kids are amazing. Now I see why you love teaching so much. Silent tears began to roll down Helena's cheeks. Gus gently wiped them away with his thumb, a gesture he'd rehearsed in secret so many times. Why are you crying? He asked, concerned. Because the man I fell in love with and the kind driver who cared for my family are one and the same, she replied, her voice trembling, and that makes me love you even more. At that moment, Richard appeared on the porch, leaning on a cane he hadn't used in years. Marcia followed, her face etched with concern. Come on, we need to talk, Richard called, his voice tired but determined. In the modest living room, lit only by an old lamp, the family gathered. Mrs. Carey was there too, impossible to keep away after all she'd witnessed. Gus, Richard began, settling into his armchair. What you did was unusual. Some might say wrong. But you know what I saw through your disguise? A man willing to set aside his pride and status to understand the true worth of people. Marcia took Richard's hand before continuing. For weeks, you've been our guardian angel in disguise. You cared for us without our knowing, listened to our worries, shared in our burdens. And now, Helena asked softly, how do we move forward? Gus stood and pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "First, I cancelled the lavish engagement party as originally planned," he explained, noticing the concern on Marcia's face. "But I've organized something different, something that truly reflects who we are." He opened the envelope to reveal a new invitation. It was simple and handcrafted, adorned with small pressed flowers reminiscent of those in the community garden. "The party will be here, in the neighborhood, in the park by the community garden," he explained. "Mrs. Carey has agreed to help make the sweets with Marcia, and all the neighbors have offered to help with the decorations. And the money saved from not throwing a lavish party, it will go into a special fund for your father's treatment." Helena covered her mouth in emotion as her parents exchanged surprised, touched glances. Mrs. Carey sniffled, nervously fiddling with her colorful umbrella. "But there's one condition," continued Gus, now addressing Richard and Marcia. "You have to accept my help with Dad's treatment, not as charity, but as a son who now understands the true meaning of family." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft ticking of the old wall clock, a silent witness to so many important moments. Outside, the full moon bathed the community garden in light, where everything in Gus's life had begun to change. The week that followed the revelations completely transformed the neighborhood's routine. News that the famous businessman Gus Mitchell was, in fact, the beloved rideshare driver known simply as Gus, spread quickly. Yet rather than the scandal of his disguise dominating conversations, it was his quiet kindness that everyone remembered. "Remember when he helped Mrs. Maria with her groceries?" neighbors would remark. "And all the times he stayed late helping Richard in the garden." At Mrs. Carey's bakery, now the official meeting spot for engagement party preparations, Gus continued showing up every morning. No longer disguised, yet still dressed simply, he was always ready for a cup of coffee and a friendly chat with the locals. "Thank goodness I no longer have to pretend that your coffee is the best in the world," he joked with Mrs. Carey one morning. "Now I can admit it really is." Helena, who once juggled 2 jobs, now focused solely on her work as a teacher and on the reading project. The club for underprivileged children had even gained a new permanent volunteer, Gus, who reserved his Wednesday mornings for the project. Who would have thought that the owner of GM Tech can do such funny voices for every character? One child exclaimed during a storytelling session. Meanwhile, Richard began treatment at one of the city's top clinics, not because Gus forced him, but because the family made the decision together. Contributions to the special treatment fund came not only from the money saved on a lavish party, but also from many locals eager to help, even with small donations. "It's not about the cost," explained Mr. Joe, the street cleaner who enjoyed his morning coffee with Richard. "It's about giving back for all the good the community garden has done for our families." Marcia continued making her sweets, not out of financial necessity, but out of love for her craft and the community. Her kitchen had transformed into a gathering spot where she and Mrs. Carey planned treats for the engagement party, sharing stories and laughter. "You know, Gavin, you really didn't have to come here every day," Marcia remarked one afternoon while he sampled a new brigadeiro recipe. "Mrs. Carey, now is when I need to come more than ever. This is my family," he replied, wiping a spot of chocolate from his mouth. The most significant transformation, however, was in the relationship between Gus and Helena. What could have been an irreparable breach of trust instead deepened their bond. Every night, they sat on the balcony of the yellow house, sharing the day's experiences and planning their future. "You know, Jade, my student, asked today if you'll still give rides for the reading project even after we're married," Helena mentioned one evening. "And what did you say?" asked Gus, intertwining his fingers with hers. "That some things shouldn't change just because the truth has come out." In the park by the community garden, the preparations for the engagement party progressed, with the help of the entire neighborhood. Neighbors took turns decorating with flowers from the garden, and the children from the reading club prepared special presentations. Even Mr. Joe, the street cleaner, volunteered to keep the park immaculate for the big day. Back in his Upper East Side apartment, Gus began making changes. His Italian-designed furniture was donated and replaced by cozier pieces. In place of his minimalist bar, he set up a bookshelf filled with children's books for the reading project. His important meetings now took place between storytelling sessions and visits to the community garden. "Don't you miss your old life?" George, his personal driver, asked as he drove him through the neighborhood. Gus looked out the window, watching the familiar Brooklyn streets roll by. "You know, sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to truly find who you are." And so the neighborhood that had once merely been the backdrop for his investigation became the stage for his true love story, not only with Helena, but with an entire community that taught him the real meaning of wealth. Before sunrise on the morning of the engagement party, Gus arrived at the park by the community garden. He found Richard already there, carefully watering each flower bed that would decorate the celebration. His face was noticeably brighter, a testament to the first weeks of proper treatment. "You're up early, son," Richard remarked as he leaned slightly on his cane. "Excited?" "A little," Gus admitted, grabbing a watering can to help. "But it's nothing like the anxiety I felt before when I was planning that lavish party. Today, every flower here, every detail prepared by the neighbors, tells a piece of our story." As the first rays of morning gilded the sky, other residents began to arrive, bringing colorful ribbons, paper lanterns, borrowed tables, and chairs. The park transformed organically, like a collective embrace made manifest in decoration. At Mrs. Carey's bakery, she and Marcia led a team of volunteers who took turns preparing treats and setting up the cake table. The aroma of freshly baked bread and homemade sweets filled the street, drawing even more curious helpers. "I never imagined I'd be making an engagement cake for my daughter, with so much love and so little sugar," Marcia joked, adjusting her carrot cake recipe to accommodate Richard's new dietary needs. Helena spent the morning at school, insisting on teaching as usual. Her students, however, had secretly prepared a special presentation for the party, rehearsed during breaks under the guidance of their coordinator. "Teacher," said little Jade, her shyness evident, "will you still teach here after you marry Uncle Gus?" "Of course, dear," Helena replied, moved by the child's concern. "Some things are just too precious to change." In the early afternoon, George arrived driving not the luxurious Mercedes, but the same silver Civic that had witnessed so many pivotal moments. The car was decorated with flowers from the community garden and colorful ribbons crafted by the children from the reading club. "Dr. Mitchell," George said as he handed over the keys, "you were right. Sometimes luxury is found in the simplest details." The park came alive as final preparations were made. Mr. Joe, now dressed in his best, coordinated the arrangement of chairs with the precision of a master of ceremonies. Every bench was cleaned and lovingly decorated, and every flower bed was naturally integrated into the decor. "Look at this transformation," an elderly neighbor commented, admiring the space. "It's as if Richard's garden has blossomed in an entirely new way today." In his Upper East Side apartment, Gus prepared differently from how he had imagined months earlier. Instead of the outrageously expensive Italian suit, he chose a simpler yet elegant outfit. In the jacket pocket, along with the engagement ring, he carried the worn-out cap that had been his companion through weeks of discovery. Meanwhile, at the Yellow House, Helena got ready with the help of her mother and Mrs. Carey. Her dress, though simple, featured delicate handmade details contributed by several neighborhood ladies, small embroideries, ribbons, and special accents. "Sweetheart," Marcia said as she adjusted Helena's veil, "you're as beautiful as the love that brought this entire community together." As the sun began to set, the park by the community garden was transformed. The lights from neighboring houses combined with paper lanterns hanging from trees created an almost magical atmosphere. The scent of Mrs. Carey's treats mingled with the fragrance of garden flowers, forming a unique and truly special experience. Guests started to arrive, a curious mix of GM Tech executives, school teachers, students from the reading club, neighbors, and friends. They mingled naturally, sharing stories about the couple, the neighborhood, and the transformations they had witnessed. Night had fully fallen over Brooklyn when the engagement party reached its most anticipated moment. The park, illuminated by hundreds of tiny lights and colorful lanterns, looked like something out of a modern fairy tale, not one of castles and carriages, but of true love blossoming amid community gardens and corner bakeries. Gus stood in the center of the park, near an improvised floral arch. His heart pounded, not from the nerves of a formal celebration, but from the joy of seeing so many familiar faces. Faces he had come to know through the windows of his silver Civic, and who were now an inseparable part of his life. Helena appeared, escorted by Richard, who now walked with more confidence after weeks of proper treatment. Her simple dress shone under the lantern light, the delicate embroidery sparkling like earthly stars. Every step she took was met with smiles and tears from those present, each one feeling they were a vital part of this story. When father and daughter reached the center of the park, Richard took both Helena's and Gus's hands in his. "Before we officially begin this celebration," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want to share a story with everyone." A respectful silence fell over the park. The children from the reading club, seated on colorful cushions in the front, a row listened with rapt attention. A few months ago, a young entrepreneur decided to disguise himself as a rideshare driver to get to know our family. He could have discovered dark secrets. He could have been disappointed. He might have given up. But do you know what he discovered? He discovered that true wealth isn't in bank accounts or expensive cars. It's in a shared cup of coffee at Mrs. Carey's bakery, in the calloused hands that tend a community garden, in the smile of a child learning to read. Marcia stepped forward with the cake she had lovingly baked. "And we discovered too," she continued softly, "that sometimes you need someone to see you in your simplest form to appreciate your true greatness." Then little Jade, Helena's student, stood up holding a book. "Teacher, we wrote a story for you and for Uncle Gus." And so the students began their surprise presentation, a simple yet moving tale of a prince who discovered that his true castle was a 2-story yellow house. Gus looked at Helena, seeing in her tear-filled eyes the reflection of his own transformed love. He removed the worn-out cap from his pocket, the very cap that had been his companion through so many discoveries, and handed it to her, along with his engagement ring. "This cap," he said, his voice echoing softly in the park, "helped me see what really matters in life. It taught me that true love needs no disguises, that family isn't measured by surnames or bank balances, and that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to find who you really are." Helena took the cap tenderly, placing it carefully on the table beside the cake. "And this neighborhood," she replied, "taught me that sometimes the charming prince comes disguised as a rideshare driver, and that the real fairy tales happen in community gardens and neighborhood bakeries." The celebration that followed was far different from the originally planned lavish affair. GM Tech executives danced with children from the reading club, teachers mingled with businessmen, and everyone, neighbors and friends alike, was united by the simple, genuine transformation that Gus had undergone. As the night wore on, Richard gathered everyone for a special toast. His voice, stronger now than in recent weeks, resonated throughout the park. "To family, not the one you're born into and see in framed portraits, but the one you build day by day, gesture by gesture, love by love. And to our dear Gus, to Gavin Mitchell, who had to disguise himself to discover that he was already exactly who he was meant to be." The lights from the surrounding houses shone like stars. The community garden exuded its nocturnal fragrance of herbs and blooms, and at the center of it all, a couple discovered that true love needs no disguise. It only requires the courage to be real. And so, under the starry Brooklyn sky, amidst community gardens and nurtured dreams, a new story began. Not a tale of princes and castles, but one of real people, genuine love, and the discovery that sometimes the greatest treasure is the courage to be who we truly are.